us. Happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there. And we're excited. We're veering a little off the real estate topic today to celebrate LGBTQ Pride, which sadly we will not have our usual parade in New York, but it's important to celebrate this month. And we have a really wonderful guest joining us to talk about the Supreme Court decision, the amazing Supreme Court decision. And that's Alejandra Caraballo, who is a great Brooklynite. She's a staff attorney at the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. She's the secretary of LGBTQ Rights Committee at the New York Bar Association, a board member of the Translatina Network, and also the first openly trans member of a community board in Brooklyn. So welcome. Thank you for joining us. I need to say a few things before I hand it over to Alejandra. One is that most people know me as running this real estate team, which I'm very proud of, but a lot of people know that I've had a long history in the LGBTQ movement, starting in 1978 in San Francisco, where I worked with Harvey Milk and organized with Cleve Jones the first statewide march for employment rights. So it's fitting that we have this conversation today. And that was a march on Sacramento in 1979. I was mentioning to Alejandra before that I was privileged to know Marsha Johnson, who was one of the original Stonewall activists, rioters. And at a young age, I met her at a volunteer night for the National Gay Task Force, it was called then, in Manhattan. And, you know, I think we all need to learn. I was a young man and uncomfortable. You know, I think everyone, if the events of the last month have taught us, we all have a lot of learning to do. I want to say one other thing before I introduce Alejandra, which is one of the things I'm most inspired by is in particular, the young Latino and Latina activists in New York. I've been privileged to get to know so many of them, and they're just an incredible group of folks. And they inspire me so much. There's a cohesion between them, and just some of the smartest, you know, folks I've seen in the, you know, fighting for queer rights in recent times. So hats off to all of you, because you're just amazing. So with that, on that note, I'll hand it over to Alejandra, who will talk about the recent decision, and we're also open to questions, and you can do that in the chat or on Facebook Live. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, for that wonderful introduction. So yeah, this past Monday, the Supreme Court issued its ruling in Bostock. For a lot of people I don't know, there's actually 3 underlying cases for this decision. There was Bostock v. Clayton County, Zarda v. Altitude Express, and Harris Funeral Homes v. EEOC. The first 2 I mentioned, Zarda and Bostock, featured cases centered around sexual orientation under Title VII, and the last one, Harris Funeral Homes, was about gender identity and transgender status in the workplace under Title VII. Unfortunately, Amy Stevens, the transgender woman at the center of Harris, passed away last month and wasn't able to see the outcome of her case. She passed away from kidney failure. Donald Zarda, which actually came out of New York, the Zarda case, was when you jump out of planes,
parachute?
Yeah, like he was an instructor for a skydiving company, and he unfortunately passed away during a skydiving accident. So the only plaintiff who was still alive was actually Gerald Bostock, who lived in Georgia, and he was a member of his local gay softball league. And when his coworkers found out, his employer fired him. And in Donald Zarda's case, when he was skydiving, a woman was uncomfortable because it was a tandem jump, being so close to a man like that. And as a way to put her fears and anxieties at ease, he was saying, "Oh, don't worry, I'm gay. Like, it's not a big deal." And word got back to his employer, and they fired him. After that, there's the Harris case, and she is a trans woman who worked at a funeral home, I believe, for nearly 20 years. And then she came out in 2013 as transgender, and she was going to follow the dress code as a woman and live her life as a woman and the woman that she is. And she was fired within about a week or 2 weeks after she came out. So all these cases were argued on October 8th of last year. It was one of the very, very first cases heard before the Supreme Court this term. And so there'd been a lot of anxiety about how these cases would come out. I mean, I definitely had a few nights where this was keeping me up in terms of how these cases were going to come out. There was any number of possibilities. It could have been sexual orientation was protected, but gender identity or transgender status wasn't, or transgender status was and sexual orientation wasn't, or any mixture in between, or that it doesn't protect any of it. And so it was, very kind of nerve-wracking to see, and in terms of effect on the actual LGBTQ community, I believe this was much bigger than gay marriage, because while not everybody gets married, everybody needs a job for the most part. And it's not just, employment. Title VII informs Title IX and Title VIII, which Title IX is for equal protection and civil rights in education. Title VIII is in federal funded housing. So this can affect housing, education, and employment. So this is almost every aspect of someone's life versus, the one act of getting married. And so, substantively, this was a much bigger deal. So, there was a lot of anxiety. I had been a bit of a pessimist. I think a lot of people were basically recognized at the oral arguments that everything was going to hinge on Gorsuch. Because he really leaned into I follow the logic, it makes sense. And this was kind of a purposeful effort in terms of the way that they engaged in oral arguments by the ACLU and David Cole, who argued the case, and at least for Amy Stevens, and then Pamela Carlin for the sexual orientation cases. To really take the literal definition of sex, just, beat the justices, figuratively over the head with the text, which basically says, you cannot take into account an individual's sex when making employment decisions. And so a hyper literal reading, or even just a very plain reading of the statute, says you cannot take any factor of sex into account. And that can also mean, if David is married to John and, on Monday, or gets married on Sunday and comes in on Monday, and he's fired, but Sally married Stephen and comes in Monday as not fired, the only difference is their sex, and you're firing one based on the sex of their partner. And you're taking sex into account when you're making that employment decision. And the same thing with transgender status. You're adhering to sex stereotypes, and you're basing your decision on their assigned at birth sex. Essentially, Amy Stevens is a woman, but she was assigned male at birth, and you're making a decision based on how she presents herself in the workplace. And the sex she chooses to identify as. And so, it was a very literal reading. And so it appealed to this kind of what's called textualism in a lot of conservative legal circles. And there's very wide-ranging levels of it and how it's done, but essentially Gorsuch is very much of like, I look at the four corners, like, what is it on this statute? I will look to that, and what it says is how I'll apply it. And that's essentially how it came out. The decision was hyper-technical. It was very like mechanical, did not have like sweeping language about, this is historic or anything like that. It was very like, this is how I read it, this is how I see it, this is how you interpret it, this is the hypotheticals that I've analyzed and how you apply this case. And it was very short. It was about 21 pages in total, compared to the nearly 80 something pages between the two dissents. Alito's dissent was about 54 pages. So the dissent was over double what the actual opinion was. And then that also included, I think, an additional like 30 pages of appendices and like attachments, which was really extra. And so, it was very straightforward. And so the way that that's going to apply is that, starting as of Monday, it's illegal to fire anyone based on sexual orientation or transgender status. I don't think we could have had a better decision. I really couldn't have asked for anything better. Even the language, the language around the sexual orientation portion seemed a little bit dated. It was, using the term homosexual a lot. And then the language around transgender status was actually really good. It was almost as if like a law professor at Columbia had written it. It was very like respectful and very, like, it was very good. And so it was kind of surprising in that kind of, and there's been some kind of suspicion that maybe the cases had been decided slightly differently. And that maybe there had been separate opinions, maybe one even authored by Ginsburg. But then in the drafting phase, a vote changed, potentially John Roberts' vote. And then they consolidated some of the opinions and some of the writing. So we'll never know. Maybe 20 or 30 years, a clerk will talk about what happened. But in the short term, we won't know. In the short term, it's a huge, huge win. So now it's going to have huge ramifications. A lot of people like to liken this to Obergefell. I think this is closer to Windsor. And the reason why it's closer to Windsor from 2012, one is because it's a statute. So this actually could have been fixed by Congress, and there was no need for this to go before the Supreme Court if Congress could do its job. It's had the Equality Act in front of it for years to add gender identity and sexual orientation to Title VII. But unfortunately, Congress hasn't acted. But the reason I say it's closer to Windsor is that after Windsor came out in 2012, you saw a lot of decisions at the state level getting rid of state level marriage bans, saying that if the federal government couldn't essentially define marriage in that way because it's discriminatory, the federal court started applying the same kind of logic to state level decisions. And so there was a huge kind of domino fall after Windsor, where a lot of subsequent cases basically eliminated a lot of the state marriage laws until Obergefell just was kind of the final nail in the coffin. So this is going to do the same thing. Now the new cases that are going to be coming up are, does this apply to Title IX? Title IX has slightly different language. Title VII is on account of sex. Title IX is on the basis of sex. Same thing for the most part, but they might need a little bit more, and there's a case coming out of Florida featuring a young trans boy who was using the male bathroom and was told to stop. And then now it's before the 11th Circuit in Atlanta, and that case was already argued at oral argument in December, and they still haven't decided the case. And now they've ordered additional briefing in light of Bostock. So that's going to be the biggest case in the coming months to test how far it's going to go in terms of Title IX. And then we're going to have additional cases in terms of Title VIII. And then this can extend, I mean, Justice Alito helpfully put a table together of every single federal statute and regulation that lists sex as a protected class. And so that's kind of the roadmap of like everything now that's going to be covered. Yeah, I mean, it's exciting times. It's a brave new world. You know, there's going to be a lot, keeping a lot of the civil rights groups going for the next few years in terms of like what exactly is the scope of this decision? How far reaching is it? Does it apply to healthcare? Does it apply to sports? Does it apply to all these other things that are kind of hot button issues right now? And so these things are still yet to be determined, but I'm a little bit more optimistic because, you know, this is a very solid ruling. It's 6-3. It's not like a squeaker 5-4 on narrow terms. Like this was outright discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and transgender status is discrimination.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
You mentioned that, okay, so Gorsuch is a textualist, and that it was a pretty straightforward opinion by him. 21 pages is not a long one for sure. But I mean, he's not the only textualist on the court. It would have been surprising if Thomas had joined, but Thomas did join the dissent, right? So what is the basis of this long dissent? And I mean, you know, like what's in there that like should, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I presume you've all.
So, you know, when I was in law school, there was, you know, when we learned about kind of textualism, there was the kind of original textualism, and then there's what was the Scalia new textualism, which was originalism. A lot of people hear it and they say it's original intent. It's not original intent. It's original meaning. It was what did these words mean at the time that this was written? And I don't know if you've ever, you know, read Shakespeare, but it almost feels like it's a different language. And you have to have like somebody with a PhD in like, you know, Enlightenment era arts to be able to understand like what exactly they were meaning, all the different puns, everything else, like. So language is a living thing, and it's very, very hard to know exactly what people, and even then, like people didn't fully agree what certain things meant. So it's, you know, that's kind of my critique of originalism. But essentially, there is this kind of divergence in textualism. There's the four corners approach, which is like basically what is on the page. How would any reasonable person at this time read it and see like exactly what it means? And then there is kind of this like very like reactionary conservative approach from originalism, where it's like, it's not just what it says, it's also what it meant at the time it was passed, which if it was 10 years ago is not a big deal. But now they're starting to talk like, well, it was in 1964 when Title VII passed as part of the Civil Rights Act, and therefore we have to look to 1964 and see what it meant in terms of, you know, discrimination on the basis of sex. I mean, at the time, you know, like if, I don't know if you've ever seen Mad Men, but like, you know, discrimination on the basis of sex was like, they didn't think like harassing your secretaries was discrimination. And so, but Alito went on a huge rant about this, that it's, you know, he actually called Gorsuch like a pirate sailing under the false flag of textualism, because he believed yeah, I mean in very like kind of personal terms almost. And so Alito was very, very upset that basically, I think, you know, it was a very strategic and smart play by the attorneys that brought this case and argued these cases, and that they were like, we're going to use the tools of the conservative legal movement to bring in progressive policies. And I think it was kind of a genius coup of the kind of conservative legal movement and the tools that they've used in their statutory interpretation. And then just kind of one final part on Alito, you know, he brought up, like, first he turned to the dictionary. Gorsuch also had this.
Oh, they always turn to the dictionary.
I mean, they love citing dictionaries. Like, it's this, you know,
it's like a bad speech about something where you say, well, the dictionary definition of love is, you know, it's like, really.
It's ridiculous, as if that's what something meant at the time. And it's like, you could probably pull up the dictionary of interpretation of what cool means. That doesn't mean you understand what it says when somebody says, oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
You know,
that's my problem with originalism, right? Is originalism, you have to, you're trying to take a guess at what these people 200 years ago, what they thought at the time, when really you might say, okay, well, what if they were in our day and they knew everything that we know, and they lived through like living in the present, not just like brought here through a time machine and dropped here and like, here's YouTube, right? But instead we're saying, okay, well, these people who really never were considering any of these things, because they never considered any of these things, these are not rights.
Yeah.
I just feel like that's my.
I mean,
yes.
It was particularly upsetting the way the way that Alito kind of took this on. I mean, he took, you know, the DSM-1. We're now in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Manual for Psychiatry and Psychology, and he was like, homosexuality was, you know, thought of as a mental disorder, and it was illegal in multiple states, and all of this, and this was the context. They couldn't possibly have meant that this was discrimination on the basis of sex. And then he kind of misstated he wasn't right on this point, because he said that it wasn't the first widely known surgeries for trans people didn't occur until the late 60s.
It's not true.
It's not true. There is a New York Daily News headline from 1952 where it says
Christine Jorgensen.
Yeah, blonde beauty, and it was Christine Jorgensen.
Right.
And on top of that, there was the research done by Magnus Hirschfeld in Berlin in the early 30s, and some of those first surgeries in Lily Elbe. So, you know, and there had been these, like, you know, and you can look to even, you know, the 13th century English common law, when they recognized, you know, at the time, it's a different term and one that we don't use now, but at the time they said there are 3 sexes, male, female, and hermaphrodite. And so essentially they recognized that there were people that fell in between male and female, or weren't quite one or the other, and therefore there was like a 3rd sex. And so there's always been this rich history in like all of history. And so Alito just tries to paper it over and say, well, transgender people didn't really even exist then, or weren't widely known. Like,
right.
They were.
So I want to pull this a little away from the legal discussion here in the time we have left. So, and about, you know, what's going on, what as, you know, lesbian, gay, and trans people we can be doing to, you know, be supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement, and so I thought, you know, that would be timely as well. Alejandra, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the focus on centering Black trans leaders, you know, without a Black trans woman, Marsha P. Johnson, we wouldn't be here. Like, this shirt that I'm wearing would not have happened without, you know, Marsha P. Johnson, you know, inciting the Stonewall riots. So, you know, the history of the LGBTQ movement is just completely centered around Black trans lives and trans people of color. And so, you know, I was really heartened by the Black trans rally. It occurred just a few blocks from my apartment here in Brooklyn,
yes.
At the museum. And it was, you know, I think they estimate like 13 to 15,000 people.
Yeah, it was great.
All wearing white. I mean, it was the most, like, I mean, as a trans woman, it's, you know, it's just, it means so much to see that, because, you know, trans people right now, I think are where the lesbian and gay community were like 20 years ago, like in terms of like, it's okay to like, you know, discriminate and say it's, you know, and say all these slurs and terrible things. Like we have, you know, J.K. Rowling writing 3,000 or 4,000 word anti-trans screeds. And so, you know, I think, you know, centering Black trans women in particular is really huge. And I think also amplifying and you know, not just being an ally, as I've heard, and I really strongly agree with, it's not enough to be not racist. You have to be anti-racist. Right. You have to be affirmative in your actions to dismantle the systemic racism that pervades, and you have to be deeply analytical and of you know, where you work and everything else, and see the ways that, you know, these systems work to oppress minorities. And, you know, lastly, I think, you know, if, you know, we're all working on this, you know, even as a trans Latinx woman, like I have, you know, ingrained implicit biases against, you know, other Latinx people or, you know, other people of color. And it's just this system that we've grown up under and have been brought into, just, you know, that's how it perpetuates itself. And so, you know, we have to just constantly trying to better ourselves and make sure that we, you know, we center the voices of those that are most marginalized, so that we can learn from them and their experiences and understand what we need to do.
I think that was really well said. I mean, I don't think, you know, I hope people listening and watching understand the amount of violence against trans women of color in this country is just abhorrent, and it's a constant issue. And, you know, this is something that that the lesbian and gay community needs to deal with, that we don't deal with enough. I mean, this is, you know, now is the time for everyone to really be speaking out on all these issues. You know, I've said this before here, that in a weird way, there's been a perfect storm around police violence, because I think if Hillary had been elected president, you wouldn't be seeing the reaction you saw. Not that there isn't a lot of horrible collateral damage from the Trump presidency, horrible, that needs to, but he, you know, the fact that he provided such a lack of leadership, like, and the COVID, you know, where people are literally sitting at home, in a weird way, was like a perfect storm to get people to do something. And, you know, on some level, it's sort of like, you never know, you know, something that could look terribly bad is, you know, actually could result in, you know, significant change. You know, I'm hopeful that we are on this sort of edge of significant change, because the way race is dealt with in our culture, and again, dealing with, you know, transgender people of color, is this stuff has to change. And you know, and we can't just sit back and sort of, you know, complain, but we have to be organizing and being out on the streets, which I'm grateful for your generation to be, which also just how many younger people have been out there is just like amazing to me. It's sort of, you know, and I've sort of been in touch with older activists, whether they're gay or lesbian or progressive, and, you know, all of us are just sort of grateful and thankful. And, you know, I think this is a time of great hope, you know, surrounded by a time of, you know, a lot of many difficult things. But I see us really moving forward. Paul, did you have any other thoughts or questions?
I think that you summed it up really well, Scott. So no, I would say happy Father's Day to fathers out there. Happy Sunday to everybody.
I'll add one more thing. Actually, a good friend of Alejandra's of mine will be joining us on Wednesday night. We're doing a forum on policing, before we go back to real estate next Sunday with mortgage brokers. So Jared Trujillo, who is the head of the Legal Aid Attorneys Union, and Mark Nason, who's the chair of African American Studies at Fordham University, will be in dialogue Wednesday night at 5 o'clock. So please join us then. And then we're back to real estate issues a week from today. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Alejandra, for joining us and your amazing work. You know, I'm really glad to have gotten to know you in the last couple of years, and Claire too. So
yeah, absolutely, for sure. Thank you for joining us, and thanks for that discussion, Alejandra.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, have a great Sunday.
You too.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.